Number 10. The deepest warship in the world. In June 2022, the American explorer Victor Vescovo and his team found the wreck of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a warship that was last seen in October 1944, 78 years ago. But that wasn't what made the destroyer-class ship's discovery so unique. The vessel, nicknamed Sammy B, was found 22,916 feet below the sea in the Philippines. To put this into perspective, that's over 4 miles under the ocean's waves, probably longer than you'd need to travel to get to a grocery store. This makes it the deepest shipwreck that's ever been discovered. Sammy B sits on the seabed broken in two. Despite this, the ship is in good shape, with many of its features like its torpedo tubes and pilot house remaining easily recognizable from the imagery Vescovo and his crew found. The vessel ended up in its watery grave after the Battle of Samar, where U.S. naval forces took on the Japanese in the Philippine Sea. Sammy B was able to take down one Japanese destroyer and badly damage another, but at that point it didn't have much firepower left. Eventually, the lead ship of the enemy fleet, the Yamato, dealt the final blow, sinking the U.S. destroyer and claiming the lives of 89 of its 224 crew members. Number 9. The armored car in the sand. The small island of Vlieland lies north off the coast of the Netherlands. It's so tiny that there's just one town on it. But that's not the only thing you can find here. Cars are banned on Vlieland, but there's one exception. On the sandy dunes is the Cornfield Aircraft Gun Range used by NATO, and placed there is an M113 C&V armored car. The vehicle won't be going anywhere soon since its gray frame is littered with bullet holes from an ANGAU 830mm Avenger. This 7-barrel Gatling gun is most often used on A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft, which typically use the APC as target practice. When the M113 was functional, it was used as a patrol vehicle. Commonly used by Canadian, US, and Dutch forces during the 1960s, the armored car was a deterrent during the Cold War. As time passed, the M113 grew less useful to the Dutch military and was replaced with newer alternatives. Some of the vehicles were sold on to other countries to continue their service, but this particular vehicle on Vlieland has a unique way of helping its country's forces stay on their toes. Number 8. The rare Martin Baltimore bomber. The Martin Baltimore bomber was a fighter plane used by the British Royal Air Force during World War II. With twin engines, only pieces of this US-built aircraft remain from this war machine. Well, at least until 2016, when an underwater drone captured footage off of the coast of Italy's Linosa Island, showing an intact Martin Baltimore bomber laying underwater. The only known one in existence that's complete. Even though this was an amazing find, it took until 2022 for the wreckage to be confirmed as a piece of aeronautical history, when an Italian diver named Fabio Portella saw it in the flesh. Inspired by the find, Fabio kept digging to find more information about the plane. From looking through military records and in-person accounts from old fishermen, he found out that the bomber crashed in June 1942. Despite the cause most likely being that the airplane was shot down on its way to Malta, there were still survivors, as accounts from the elderly residents of Linosa revealed that people had been rescued from the wreckage. Of the 4 crew members, one named Alec Greaves sadly died in the crash, while the others, William Fincham, Robert Purslow, and Francis Baum, ended up in POW camps. Fincham and Baum managed to survive their experience, but sadly Purslow passed away after a cholera outbreak. Do you think there could be more fighter planes like this at the bottom of the ocean? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 7. The Schwerer Gustav railway gun. As far as war machines go, you can't get much bigger than Schwerer Gustav. This rail-mounted gun was made as the German response to the Maginot Line, which defended France in the 1930s as a combination of bunkers, railway lines, and fortifications designed to keep invaders at bay. To get past such an ironclad defense, the Nazi regime came up with the Schwerer Gustav. With a gun barrel measuring over 100 feet, towering 4 stories tall, and weighing in at over 1,300 tons, it was truly a feat of engineering. That's just talking about the gun itself. Its ammunition was equally impressive. Each shell was as tall as 2 people and weighed over 20,000 pounds. As you could expect, this gave the Schwerer Gustav some serious firepower. Although the gun wasn't ready by the time Hitler wanted to invade France, Schwerer Gustav was actually used during World War II in the siege of Sevastopol in Russia in June 1942. Over 5 days, it only fired 48 rounds, but it took a team of over 500 men to keep it running. After this time, the massive gun was at its limit. Realizing how costly it was, the German army decided to shelve the giant weapon and remove it from the front lines. Schwerer Gustav would then go unseen until its remains were found discarded in a forest on April 22, 1945 in eastern Germany, after it was believed that the weapon was destroyed by the German forces to stop it from falling into their enemies' hands. Number 6. The U.S. amphibious tank in an English field. A farmer's field is usually somewhere you'd expect to see crops or animals grazing. But one field in Lincolnshire, England was home to a massive 18-ton amphibious tank. The tank was buried underground and had been there for 74 years. Built to serve in World War II, the US-made Buffalo LVT measured over 26 feet long. It's believed the craft that was found was used to help forces cross the Rhine and Elbe rivers in 1945, strategic points that were vital in helping turn the tide of the war. But how did this huge metal machine end up 30 feet below ground in a random English field? It wasn't destroyed in the war. It and other Buffalo craft were still standing. In 1947, floods swept across the country of Lincolnshire, so this tank and 11 others were sent to the town of Crowland to help build flood defenses. Sadly, though, the floods were so intense that the Buffalo LVT was swept away in the water along with 5 of its fellow vessels. The tank was eventually uncovered by a group of volunteers known as the Crowland Buffalo LVT Association after a 5-day excavation. The craft is in excellent condition despite having been underground for all this time, partly thanks to local soil with its mix of peat and clay helping to preserve it. It's hoped now that the Buffalo LVT can serve as a memorial to those catastrophic floods from decades ago. Number 5. The Roman siege engines of Jerusalem. During Emperor Nero's reign, Rome and Judea, a region that's now part of modern-day Israel, were at war. The conflict started in 66 AD after tension between the governing Roman Empire and the native Jewish population reached a burning point. Nero requested the help of a top general, Vespasian, and his son Titus to help restore order after the Roman governing body left Jerusalem a year earlier. Vespasian and Titus swept through the country on their way to Judea, retaking locations as they went. After a months-long journey, they ended up at the border of Jerusalem, ready to take back control of the pivotal city. A siege that would last over 4 months began, with Roman forces using ancient siege engines to slowly wear down Jerusalem. The most popular war machine used was the ballista, a wooden structure that worked like a cannon, firing ammunition like boulders and specially made bolts across large distances with massive destructive powers for its time. The ballista and other siege weapons used by the Romans during this attack were so powerful that there was hardly any of Jerusalem left standing by the end of the conflict. Although it was made of wood, archaeologists have not been able to find the ballistae themselves, but they found out where they would have been. Kafir Arbiv and his team discovered examples of the stone ammunition and rocks used where they were placed. After almost 200 years, we now know many of them were deployed around Cat Square, which is located in the center of modern-day Jerusalem. Number 4. The USS Grayback. In 2019, after 75 years of laying below the sea, the American submarine, the USS Grayback, was finally spotted. The Grayback was celebrated as one of the best submarines in the U.S. fleet, sinking over a dozen Japanese vessels in its time. But on its 10th patrol during World War II, it never returned from Pearl Harbor in January 1944. Due back in early March, by the end of the month, the USS Grayback was marked MIA. There was an attempt by the U.S. Navy to locate many vessels it had lost by putting together locations of where they were last seen. Although they had a location for the Grayback, why wasn't it there? The answer comes down to a simple error. When recording the latitude and longitude of the submarine's location, they were off by a single digit. Tim Taylor of the Lost 52 Project, which aims to find as many as 52 lost U.S. submarines from World War II, got in touch with Japanese researcher Yutaka Iwasaki and asked him to look at the old records that were used to determine the location. Using these reports, Iwasaki found one of interest from February 27, 1944. The radio transcript of the report said that a submarine had been hit by a Japanese Nakajima B-5N bomber, exploding and sinking it rapidly with no survivors reported. Acting on this information, Taylor and his team set out to the spot, and using an underwater drone, they found the Grayback over 100 miles away from the original reported latitude and longitude. Not only is this an amazing World War II discovery, it also provides closure to the families of those 80 men who perished on board. Number 3. The F-35 fighter jet. In November 2021, one of the most impressive modern-day war machines sunk to a watery grave. Stationed on the British naval aircraft carrier the HMS Queen Elizabeth, an F-35 fighter jet was about to take off on a routine flying operation. But the plane couldn't get airborne and plummeted off the end of the flight deck into the waters below. Thankfully, the pilot survived and was able to eject safely from the vehicle before it fell. But this meant that over $120 million of military aircraft and technology had sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Worried that this state-of-the-art machine could end up in enemy hands, a joint effort was mounted between the British, American, and Italian militaries to find the F-35 as soon as possible. Amazingly, after a week of working in secret to recover the aircraft, they found it almost a mile underwater and brought it back to the surface. It's unknown what exactly caused the F-35 jet to crash, but officials believe it could have been due to a piece of plastic sheeting that was sucked into the engine. Either way, it remains an impressive effort from all involved to find it so quickly and at such a depth. Number 2. The World War I cannon in Canada. World War I took place across most of Europe with battlefields in France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. But builders over 4,000 miles away in Ontario, Canada in 2021 found a war machine that had been used during the conflict. Construction workers in Amherstburg were demolishing an old baseball field so a school could be built on the site. As they started to turn the ground over and get rid of debris, imagine their surprise when a large Feldkanone 96 started to emerge from the dirt. But how did it end up under a baseball field in Canada? It's believed that the cannon came from a Canadian military victory at Cambrai in 1918, a location 3,935 miles away from where the weapon ended up. It was then taken back to Ontario, where it was placed at a cenotaph that was erected at this site in 1922. As the years went on and the nearby school needed more space, the cenotaph and a lot of the artifacts were moved, but the Feldkanone 96 was left behind since it was too damaged to be of any use as a display item. Interest is now being taken in this lost piece of history, though, due to the fact that the breech block underneath is still in one piece. Normally, this would be damaged by German forces to stop it from being used by the enemy. It's hoped that the cannon can be restored to its former glory soon. Number 1. The hydrogen bombs of Palomares. On January 17, 1966, a deadly crash took place and led to 4 hydrogen bombs dropping from the skies onto the Mediterranean coastline. A B-52G flew out from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, bearing 4 Type B-28R1 hydrogen bombs during Operation Chrome Dome, a typical Cold War airborne alert exercise. While refueling, the B-52 managed to hit the K-135 tanker over 31,000 feet in the air above the Spanish coast. The K-135 tanker exploded instantly when the fuel it was carrying ignited, leaving no survivors. The B-52 was a bit luckier. It fractured into pieces, with only 3 of the 7 crew members losing their lives. The deadly cargo of the B-52 was lost, leading to a frantic search to find the hydrogen bombs. 3 were located on the mainland near Palomares, a tiny fishing community in Almera, Spain. Although 1 was intact, 2 of them had partially detonated, contaminating almost a square-mile area with plutonium. But where was the 4th bomb? Despite a thorough search, the only part found was the parachute's tailplate, causing investigators to believe the bomb's chute had been released and carried out to sea by the wind. This then led to a frantic search effort by the U.S. Air Force, keen to make sure that they found the bomb before it could cause considerable damage. A local fisherman, Francisco Simo Orts, reported that he had seen the bomb fall into the sea, and this account helped the U.S. in its efforts. Francisco would even later be called Bomb Frankie. 80 days after the crash, the bomb was finally found, although the recovery mission was far from easy. On the first attempt to drag the missile back up to the surface from the Rio Almanzora Canyon, 2,550 feet below sea level, the rescue crew dropped, leading to it sinking further into the depths. Eventually, on April 7, 1966, the bomb was brought to the surface, but not before it reached a depth of 2,900 feet and tangled up one of the recovery vehicles in the process with its parachute cables. Thankfully, the bomb had not broken or detonated and was taken safely back to the USA.
7. Hideki Tojo remains. According to documents released from the US, the remains of Japan's former World War II Prime Minister, Hideki Tojo, were spread throughout the Pacific Ocean after his execution. Officials were worried followers of Hideki Tojo, one of the main individuals responsible for the Japanese assault on Pearl Harbor in 1941, were trying to recover his remains and glorify him as a martyr after all he'd done. Tojo and 6 others were burned after being executed for their heinous war crimes in 1948. The ashes were then dumped into the water by US Army aircraft. Hiroyuki Takazawa, a Japanese lecturer at Tokyo's Nihon University, found the declassified records in the US National Archives in Washington, D.C. I certify that I received the remains, supervised cremation, and personally spread the ashes of the following executed war criminals at sea from an 8th Army liaison plane, wrote a member of the US Army named Marge Luther Frierson in one document dated December 23, 1948. This was the day Tojo and the others were condemned. Frierson wrote that he watched their execution and then boarded an aircraft carrying their ashes, which were placed in separate urns. Despite the fact that there were no bodies to bury, the executed men are now memorialized at Japan's notorious Yasukuni Shrine. The Shinto shrine is dedicated to the lives of about 2.5 million Japanese men, women, and children who've died for their country since its establishment back in 1869. Tojo and the other 6 were among 14 convicted Class A war criminals that are now part of the shrine. 6. Operation Paperclip. As World War II came to a close, American and British agencies worked together to explore occupied Germany for whatever military, scientific, or technical development research they could get their hands on. As Allied forces seized German research institutions, organizations like the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee (CIOS) began collecting war-related records, resources, and scientists. The Ossenberg list, discovered in a toilet at Bonn University, was a list full of scientists and engineers that were forced to work for the Third Reich. During the Cold War, about 1,600 of these German scientists and their families were transferred to the United States in a secret mission, initially called Operation Overcast, but later renamed to Operation Paperclip. The program was run by the newly formed Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA. The goal was to harness German intellectual resources and intelligence to aid the development of US rockets, as well as biological and chemical weapons, while also ensuring such vital information did not end up in the hands of the Soviet Union. Despite his formal approval, President Harry Truman barred the CIA from enlisting any Nazi members or active Nazi supporters in this group. Nevertheless, officials at the JIOA and the Office of Strategic Services (OSS) ignored this order by removing signs and evidence of war crimes from the chosen scientists' records, believing their information was critical to the country's post-war attempts despite the past. Werner von Braun was one of the most well-known recruits of the bunch. He was the project leader of the Peenemünde Army Research Center in Germany, who was key in designing the fatal V-2 rocket that spread devastation across England during the war. He and a handful of other rocket scientists traveled to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Ground NM under the disguise of War Department special employees to help with US Army rocket testing. Von Braun later went on to become the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and was the principal designer of the Saturn V launch vehicle, which took 24 astronauts to the moon. Although supporters of this covert operation say that if these Nazi scientists had not been brought over to the United States, the balance of power could have easily swayed towards the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the other side points to the moral cost of ignoring their war crimes without consequences or responsibility. 5. Hitler's presence in Colombia. The US looked into allegations that Adolf Hitler had managed to survive after World War II and lived in Colombia during the 1950s. Documents pertaining to this inquiry have been available for years, but have recently resurfaced in the context of about 2,800 classified documents related to the killing of former American President John F. Kennedy. Based on these leaked documents, CIA operatives learned from a former SS officer that Adolf Hitler might have lived in Colombia in the 1950s in a commune built of ex-Nazis. After originally dismissing this intelligence, the agents eventually filed a report to their superiors referencing a photograph. Former SS officer Philip Citroen called the CIA and notified them of his meeting with a man claiming to be the former Nazi ruler. By the time the agents decided to investigate, the suspect, Adolf Schuttelmeyer, had escaped to Argentina. But the CIA was doubtful of the source material and decided to discontinue its investigation. The former SS officer stated in CIA documents that the individual he met looked very much like Adolf Hitler and claimed to be him. Citroen stated that he met Hitler in Residencias Coloniales in Tunia, Colombia, which he characterized as being full of German Nazis. The CIA dismissed this alleged proof, but in 1955 a second individual, codenamed Simelodi III, gave authorities the same story, stating that on repeated trips to Colombia, Citroen met with the man suspected of being Hitler once a month. This also provided the agents with an image of Citroen and the supposed dictator, who was identified on the reverse end as Adolf Schuttelmeyer. According to Simelodi III, Hitler left Colombia in January 1955 and relocated to Argentina. Based on Simelodi's new information, the CIA prepared a statement and sent it to their supervisors, but they proposed abandoning the prospective probe since they couldn't confirm what the two had claimed and the financial investment would have been too enormous to act on without concrete proof. 4. Project Zebra. Almost 75 years ago, an airplane on a secret mission for Russia crashed into the Pasquotank River in Elizabeth City. It was kept hidden there for decades. The mission was part of Project Zebra, a collaboration effort between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Soviet Union Premier Joseph Stalin. The United States agreed to provide the Soviet Union with a modified version of the PBY Catalina, an aircraft that could attack submarines. The PBM-1 Nomad, a Russian variant of the plane, had an increased fuel reserve and a greater range. According to M.G. Krisky's novel, the Navy built 185 of these huge aircraft at a shipyard in Philadelphia. Over the course of 18 months in 1944 and 1945, over 300 Soviet pilots were trained at the Elizabeth City Coast Guard facility. According to Don Pendergraft, director of the Museum of the Albemarle in Elizabeth City, this partnership was one of the last of its kind between the countries. Marjorie Berry, a local historian who's examined the events, says that Russian aviators frequently came into town and purchased a large quantity of clothing, cigarettes, and French perfume from the local pharmacy shop. They would put it on the Russian black market, where items like this were virtually impossible to come by. Berry remembers her father's memories of watching aviators who couldn't speak English shopping in downtown businesses. He had no idea what the Russians were doing there, but he noticed how kind they were. The late Greg Gagarin, a translator and avionics specialist, contributed copies of mission documentation and images to the city's museum 10 years ago. Gagarin was critical to Project Zebra's overall success. In 1943, he graduated from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with a degree in electrical engineering and decided to join the Navy. He was told to go to a Pacific-based seaplane unit and was sent to the Naval Air Station at Norfolk. Nothing further about the covert operation was revealed to him. Gagarin then wandered about the base for 3 days before determining what he had to do next. The incident happened at the end of the program. On January 11, 1945, a Nomad filled with American products took off over the Pasquotank River in the dark. It was flown by a Royal Canadian Air Force soldier and carried 8 other aviators inside. Soon after departing, a section of the plane collided with the water and plummeted straight into the Pasquotank River, killing 5 individuals on board. The pilot and the 3 others were left unharmed. The pilot later admitted that he lost his bearings after following safety lights on the ground and switching to instrumentation for night flight. The Museum of the Albemarle remembered those who died in this disaster on January 11th in Elizabeth City. The Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, as well as Russian students and elected leaders attended the remembrance. Locals were supposed to act out a reenactment and pay their respects. 3. The Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Initiative was a US government research project that developed the first atomic weapons for a few years, mainly from 1942 to 1945. American scientists, most of whom had escaped their fascist governments in Europe, were told of breakthroughs in nuclear fission in 1939 and worried that Nazi Germany might produce a nuclear weapon themselves. In the same year, scientists in the States encouraged President Franklin D. Roosevelt to launch a program to explore the possible military applications fission could be used for, and $6,000 was authorized. In response, the Uranium Advisory Committee was formed. The project can be traced back to December 6, 1941, with the establishment of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, led by Vannevar Bush. The project was codenamed Manhattan in 1942, after the location of Columbia University, where much of the research was conducted during its early stages. Both the University of California and the University of Chicago, where physicist Enrico Fermi created the first nuclear reactor in 1942, conducted the research. In 1943, scientists led by J. Robert Oppenheimer constructed a laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, to build the infamous bomb. Scientists from the Manhattan Project detonated the first atomic bomb in a test at Alamogordo, New Mexico. The project had cost $2 billion and employed 125,000 people by the time of its completion. 2. Project Habakkuk. During World War II, the British devised Project Habakkuk, whose goal was to build an aircraft carrier out of pikecrete, a combination of wood pulp and ice, to combat the German U-boat threat in the mid-Atlantic. Jeffrey Pike, who worked at Combined Operations Headquarters, came up with the initial idea. The project was cancelled though, after scale tests and the construction of a design on Patricia Lake in Jasper National Park in Alberta, Canada, failed due to rising costs, new demands, and the availability of longer-range aircraft and escort carriers, which closed the mid-Atlantic gap and need for the project. Meanwhile, in the United States, the manufacturing of M29 Weasels for Project Plow, a program thought up to construct an elite force for winter operations in Norway, Romania, and the Italian Alps. Pike developed the concept for Habakkuk. He had been thinking about how to safeguard seaborne landings and Atlantic convoys from aviation strikes. Steel and aluminium were in low supply since they were needed for more pressing uses. Pike determined the solution was simply ice, which could be produced for 1% of the energy required to produce an equivalent amount of steel. He recommended that a natural or man-made iceberg be leveled to create a runway and carved out to store planes. This wasn't the first time the proposal was introduced either. In 1940, an idea for an ice island was passed through higher-ups, but it was seen as a joke by most personnel, notably Neville Shute, who openly criticized the plan. The document was retrieved just as it was about to reach the first Sea Lord's mailbox. In official papers, the project's codename was frequently misspelled as Habakkuk. This might have been due to Pike's mistake. In one unsigned document, it is spelled Habakkuk. Post-war publications by those involved in the project such as Perrotts and Goodeve used the correct spelling, with 1 B and 3 Ks. The name references the project's lofty goal: "Behold ye among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told you." Habakkuk 1:5. 1. Operation Overlord. In 1944, a campaign was developed for the invasion of continental Europe during World War II and was given the name Operation Overlord, which was also used to refer to the Battle of Normandy. The most crucial part of the project was to get the Allied troops inside Europe. They were aware the plan would fail and that there would be heavy casualties, but they went ahead with the plan, and miraculously, it was a success. The United States, United Kingdom, and Canada provided the majority of forces. Australia, Belgium, the Czech Republic, France, Greece, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, and Poland were also among the other countries that sent troops. The preparations were extensive and complicated, and Overlord was among the biggest and bloodiest amphibious assaults in military history. Almost 3 million men crossed the English Channel from England to Normandy, which at the time was heavily occupied by the Germans. The first 40 days were spent capturing Caen and Cherbourg, especially Cherbourg, for its well-positioned deep-water port. Brittany, a region in France, and its Atlantic ports would then be targeted. The northern French railways and highways would be bombarded to prevent reinforcements from arriving, and the Allies would then go 125 miles southwest of Paris. The Allies dominated the territory between Loire in the south and the Seine in the northeast. Meanwhile, the Allies worked hard to convince Germans the invasion would take place somewhere else. The Allies practiced military deception in the months leading up to the invasion. In 1944, Germany's coastline defenses were relatively low. After Normandy was chosen as the invasion site, it was decided to try and fool the Germans into thinking it was a fake invasion and that the real one would happen somewhere else. This was known as Operation Bodyguard. In the weeks leading up to the operation, the Allies tried to persuade the Germans that a major invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais and Norway. Deception was a business in and of itself. It included fake communications, dummy tanks near Dover and the south coast of England, the use of double agents to spread false information. The deception was a huge success. It caused Hitler to postpone reinforcements from the Pas de Calais region for weeks. The original plan specified 14 days. In his memoirs, General Omar Bradley termed Bodyguard the single worst farce of the war. The Battle of Normandy continued until August 30th, 1944, when German forces fled over the Seine. This was the end of Operation Overlord and a major turning point in the war. 10. Underwater Military Museum. In a bid to attract tourists, the Jordanian government lowered 19 decommissioned military vehicles into the Red Sea near the city of Aqaba in 2019. The collection of drowned machinery includes tanks, an ambulance, a military crane, a troop carrier, a combat helicopter, an anti-aircraft battery, and several large guns. They can be found 92 feet beneath the water's surface, where they sit arranged in tactical formation. In recent years, the Aqaba Special Economic Zone Authority, ASEZA, has found a new way to generate revenue. In 2020, their first ever underwater military museum was created as a unique diving experience for tourists. The idea was bolstered by the Jordanian royal family, inspired by their generational passion for diving. Not all the vehicles are military equipment, and some of them have been there since long before the museum was put together. In 1985, the late King Abdullah ordered the sinking of the Spanish cargo ship Cedar Bride. 3 years earlier, an accident blasted a hole in the vessel, leaving it as a half-submerged eyesore until the king decided there was a better place for it. In 1999, an anti-aircraft tank became Aqaba's second intentionally placed wreck. 9. Thailand Tank Dump. In 2010, a photo of a tank being dumped off the side of a ship emerged online. Initially, this caused some people to wonder if someone had gotten away with polluting the environment. It's a fair cause for concern, especially in an age where marine pollution is wreaking havoc on ocean life. Luckily, this wasn't the case. As it turned out, the whole thing was orchestrated in order to hopefully improve the ecosystem's fish stocks. The photo was taken when a total of 25 old military tanks and trucks were dumped into the water near the Gulf of Thailand. The goal of this action is to create an artificial reef with the hopes that corals will eventually form on them. This would, in turn, help to restore the region's ailing fish populations off the Narathiwat province coast. 8. D-Day. In the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, Allied troops stormed the coast of Normandy, France, on a mission to free the country from Nazi control. This day would famously come to be known as D-Day. It was one of the largest amphibious invasions, and it was the largest seaborne invasion in history. The campaign was successful, marking the beginning of the end of the war. However, victory came at a cost for the Allies, and not everything went according to plan. In fact, some things went wrong right from the beginning. A fleet of 29 amphibious tanks, known as duplex drive tanks or DD Shermans, were outfitted with flotation devices designed to enable soldiers to steer them to shore. Unfortunately, these modified vehicles were only equipped to withstand 1-foot swells, and the seas were much rougher than that. The tanks were no match against the 6-foot waves they encountered. Most of the drivers were still about 0.6 miles away from the beach after trying their best to reach dry land. Only 2 of the tanks actually made it to shore. Archaeologists explored the area's waters for the first time in the year 2000. They found some of these doomed machines sitting upright, while others were on their side along the ocean floor. These tanks represent just a small portion of the losses the Allies experienced during D-Day. 7. Marlin Head Graveyard. The waters off Ireland's most northerly point, known as Marlin Head, were once a popular navigation route for convoys during both World Wars. As a result, the region became a major graveyard for wartime wrecks. Included among the submerged vehicles is the HMS Audacious, the first British battleship that was lost in World War I. It was built between 1910 and 1913 for the Royal Navy. Its career was short-lived because in October 1914, the ship was sunk by a German naval mine off the Donegal coast. Built as a super dreadnought for the Royal Navy, the Audacious was a beefed-up version of the original 1906 dreadnought design. This sparked a pre-war arms race between Britain and Germany. It was well armed, but it proved to be no match against the mine that blew it up. The explosion sent the ship plunging 213 feet to the seabed below. Another major wreck that can be found near Marlin's Head is the SS Empire Heritage. Originally built as a British whaling ship, it was later converted into a tanker. It was carrying 16,000 tons of fuel, as well as various military vehicles, including Sherman tanks and trucks. Then, in September 1944, the vessel was struck by a German U-boat torpedo, sending it to a watery grave. The ship and the vehicle sank to the seafloor, but were rediscovered in 1995. They remain at the site today as an eerie reminder of a bygone era that saw countless countries in conflict with one another. 6. USS Spiegel Grove. The 510-foot-long US Navy dock landing ship, known as the USS Spiegel Grove, was built in the mid-1950s. She never saw actual combat, but had an active career traveling all over the world. The vessel sailed to Guantanamo Bay for its shakedown cruise, before participating in amphibious training exercises off the coast of Onslow Beach, North Carolina. After that, Spiegel Grove completed a 6-month tour in the Mediterranean. For the next several years, the ship spent most of its time primarily along the North American East Coast and in the Caribbean. In 1961, the ship embarked on a 4-month-long goodwill tour to Africa with medical supplies, toys, books, seeds, food, and disaster supplies at the ready. Along this journey, it stopped in Gambia, South Africa, the Seychelles, Kenya, Togo, Gabon, and Zanzibar before it returned home on September 8th. Then, in January of the next year, she traveled to Virginia in order to complete an overhaul done by the Horn Brothers shipyard. In 1974, the vessel helped to evacuate hundreds of Americans from Cyprus, following a historic coup that's kept the island nation divided ever since. 2 years later, the ship participated in another civilian evacuation mission called Operation Fluid Drive. This time, the vessel's crew helped to rescue Americans from Lebanon after civil war broke out in the country. Spiegel Grove was taken out of service in October of 1989. After years of running into financial problems and legal red tape, it was towed from Virginia to Florida in 2002 and sunk off Key Largo. It sank too fast and landed upside down on the ocean floor, but was turned on its starboard side by the military several months later at an immense six-cost figure. Today, the wreck functions as an artificial reef for wildlife and remains a popular diving site for tourists and adrenaline junkies. Would you rather explore the underwater wreckage of a World War II ship or discover the remains of a never-before-seen plane crash? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. 5. Discarded tanks in Papua New Guinea. In 2010, a pair of World War II-era tanks were found in the shallow waters off Papua New Guinea. They sat just 13 feet beneath the surface, yet been largely forgotten about for more than 60 years. In fact, it's believed that they'd sat untouched in the Makada harbor until Swiss diver Franco Banfi discovered them. Each tank weighs around 15 tons and is equipped with a once-functional cannon and 2 machine guns. These long-forgotten vehicles are remnants of a time when tanks helped to turn the conflict in the Allies' favor. They played a role in several important battles, including the New Guinea campaign in the South Pacific. The campaign began in 1942 when the Japanese invaded Papua and New Guinea and lasted until the very end of the war in 1945, which is when the tanks were dumped into the water. This was a popular way for Americans to get rid of vehicles and equipment throughout the South Pacific that they no longer needed. A lot of the time, the vehicles were in perfectly good condition, but it simply wasn't worth the cost of relocating the surplus back to the US. 4. Saipan's war machines. Saipan is part of the Commonwealth of the US and is located roughly 5,900 miles from the American mainland. This Pacific paradise is the largest of the Mariana Islands, and during World War II, it was under Japanese control. From June 15th to July 9th, 1944, a brutal weeks-long battle between the US and Japanese forces took place. In the end, America was victorious and captured Saipan to claim as their own. Since then, numerous historic vehicles from both sides have sat in the waters off the island. The submerged wrecks include 2 Japanese planes, 2 American planes, several merchant ships, some landing vehicles, as well as other machines. Some of these vehicles were destroyed in combat and sank, while others were deliberately dumped into the water at the end of the war. One of the most famous Saipan wrecks is the Shoan Maru, a Japanese transport ship which now sits at a depth of roughly 30 feet. It's one of the many diving attractions around the island. Most of the dives are accessible to entry-level divers. However, for those with more experience, there's a submerged pile of World War II-era junk sitting at the bottom of the water. Jeeps, airplane parts, and other discarded items that the Americans tossed when the war ended can be found here. 3. World's largest submerged plane. In 2016, an Airbus A300 cargo plane was deliberately sunk off the coast of Kusadasi, a city in western Turkey. The aircraft had recently retired after a long career in the sky, before plunging to its final resting place off the Aegean coast, where it functions as an artificial reef for marine life. Measuring 177 feet, 54 meters from nose to tail, and with a wingspan of 144 feet, the A300 is the world's largest submerged airplane. Turkish officials made the decision to sink it in order to increase tourism to the region by turning it into a dive site. In the handful of years since the aircraft was relocated, it's now covered in coral and is quickly turning into a thriving aquatic habitat. As it turns out, the move to boost tourism worked. Diving has increased noticeably in the region, and it's all due to the rare and unique opportunity to see fish and other creatures living in and around a cargo plane. 2. Chuk Lagoon. During World War II, Japan's main naval base was located roughly 970 nautical miles northwest of New Guinea in the South Pacific. Known today as Chuk Lagoon, this area contains an eerie graveyard of war machines, including a ghost fleet of Imperial Japanese ships, tanks, and planes. The vehicle sank in February 1944 during a massive air and sea attack that the US Navy launched against the Japanese, known as Operation Hailstone. Altogether, over 200 planes and at least 40 marine vessels were destroyed. Since then, the vehicle cemetery at Chuk Lagoon, formerly known as Chuk Lagoon, is now a popular diving site. Experienced divers are capable of entering depths where they're likely to discover things they've never seen before. The graveyard contains a plethora of military and everyday items, such as medicine bottles, plates, shoes, battery guns, ammunition, and gun masks. 1. SS Probitas. Towards the tail end of World War I, the SS Probitas, an Italian diesel-powered cargo ship, was built in 1918. Interestingly, after many years in service, the ship even went on to assist in World War II. However, all things must eventually come to an end. It was ultimately sank by the Germans during an air raid off the Albanian coast on September 25, 1943. The 377-foot vessel sank to its final resting place below the Bay of Saranda. The ship remains on its port side and is still visible at the site today. The SS Probitas sits less than 1,000 feet, 300 meters from the shoreline, and lies at a maximum depth of 59 feet below the water. At its shallowest point, the ship is just 10 feet from the surface, making certain parts of the wreck easy to spot with an aerial view. In order to signal danger underneath the waves, the Probitas is marked above the water with a cardinal buoy. It's a popular diving site for thrill seekers, and the visibility around the wreckage is decent, at about just under 66 feet. Thanks for watching. Do you think we should continue dropping vessels into the ocean in order to restore underwater ecosystems? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye.